2 other talks as part of this first session just before lunch. And I'm going to introduce to you now David Schley. David Schley is from Sense About Science, and their mission. What's their mission, David?
To stand up for the public interest in sound science and evidence.
Excellent. It's a cool mission. So we're very excited to hear from David now. It's going to be another talk after that, but I'll introduce that separately. And this talk is on communicating science to be helpful beyond transparency, which sounds really interesting.
Right, well, thank you very much. Well, I'm really delighted to speak to everyone today. I'm going to take the liberty of trying to go back to asking the question of why we communicate, because I think knowing what our goals are is how we're going to measure what success looks like. And I think, for me, when you stand up somewhere, the question is, we have to be honest about why we're actually communicating. And I think, certainly from my experience, is often a lot of our science communication is PR, isn't it? We have to do PR for our university or our department or our initiative and our project. And that might serve an important function in terms of securing funding and engagement, but it's not actually that useful to society, is it? So I think a lot of the conversations we have are thinking about, why do you communicate, you know? Is it about being accountable to your funders, which in the vast majority of cases is, again, it's the public, and helping to share the consequences of your work that you do. That's really important. Some people communicate to build trust in science. Again, that's really valuable for getting engagement. We need participation in science to advance it often. But those are in some ways quite self-serving. So I think what I'm going to try and do today is kind of advocate, and I think looking around the room, probably lots of people who don't need persuading, but it's about thinking about how do we make our science communication useful. And often we talk about improving science literacy. I think the way I like to think about it is, you help people to understand maths and science in a way that they're able to have a conversation about it. That's what makes your communication useful to them. So for me, useful communication is empowering. It turns the information that you have into knowledge for people. And in our work, things we get asked about maths and science, and I think this probably resonates with some of the points David made earlier, is people ask us, they want to get to grips with the science that's going on. They want to know, how much do we know, i.e. what don't we know? They ask us, okay, what's the balance of scientific opinion in this area? And often those questions about legitimacy of a study that they see. So I think not all communication is two-way, but I would argue you do need to engage with your audience to understand what they want and what they need. And so depending where you are in a project or an initiative or a new area, that is a critical part of the work we have to do. So I think empowering people is about enabling them to ask questions and evaluate answers. So in short, no one wants to be lectured and talked down to. We want to give people a ticket to the party being that ability to discuss the science and maths and evidence that's relevant to social issues and that matter to people, and being able to do that in a critical way. What does that mean in practice? Well, I want to kind of give you a couple of examples from a new global initiative called Risk Know-How, which is about communicating risk and improving understanding of risk across the world. So imagine, you're a farmer in West Africa. You've got a choice between a high-yield crop or a drought-resistant crop that has a much lower yield. Now, last year there was a once-in-a-century drought. So what do you do this year? Which seeds do you pick? Anyone? I've given you a choice of 2. Anyone want to see? Okay, fair enough. It's hard, isn't it? You don't really have the information. Is that a helpful way of, communicating that information? No, because it doesn't help me answer the question that's important to me at this point. If anything, that sort of thing, it's once in a century, it happened last year. I'm good to go for the next 99 years, aren't I? So it can be really unhelpful. So I always think, we start, especially around risk, you start, what's the question people actually want to answer? Then we can move on to all the stuff you really want them to know. I'll give you another example, which is scientists in Bangladesh forecast storms. They put out lovely maps. They give the probability of storms and sea surges happening. They broadcast it on the radio, but they still see fishers going out to sea. So what's gone wrong with the communication there, do you think? Yes, go on.
You don't know what that forecast means in terms of it actually being safe to say it.
Yeah, you might not know what it means. Does the forecast mean it's safe to say it? Yeah.
Or you may not have any option.
You may not have any option. Yes. I think that's exactly the point, I think. If you speak to the fishers, they will say, well, actually, yes, there's a risk of drowning. There's also a risk of my family starving if I don't get any food in. So the reality is they are making trade-offs, just like we all make trade-offs every day in our lives with information and risks. From crossing the road, we all make trade-offs. So I think that's really important to always think about where your information is in that context. Because I think the mistake here is assuming that the response is wrong, and assuming that the response indicates a lack of understanding. It doesn't. It's just that people are having to make choices. So I've talked about making sure your science is relevant, and for us, we always talk about communication and engagement together, and it is about involving the people you want to reach in your work. Now, it depends, obviously, what work you're doing. You wouldn't do this every time on every piece, but as a broader piece, for us, there's a key point to effective communication. So the obvious thing is scoping your issue, looking at what people are actually discussing, what are the issues, what are the challenges there, and then involving people. This is the critical part. I'm going to use the term public quite broadly, but I think you can consider it being a specific audience in your context. That sector of the public passionate about it. But who's involved in this issue? Who's got knowledge? Who's talking about it? Who, probably really important, who isn't part of the conversation, who should be? Because once you've had those conversations, then you can actually kind of plan what communications you're going to do. You can develop it. You can ideally co-develop it in partnership and then test it with that audience. And again, we talk about user testing, but at the heart of that is a back and forth of working with people and developing things together. And then we get to the dissemination point, don't we, where we actually share that information out. But I think the critical thing is involve people and involve them early. I want to give an example of what we call termed public engagement partnerships. And this was with Christina Pagel at UCL and David Spiegelhalter here at Cambridge, and came from the baby heart surgery scandal. So this was quite a while back, but at Bristol Infirmary, there were lots of avoidable deaths that were covered up in heart surgery for babies and young children. And that led to a breakdown of trust between parents. People didn't trust the hospitals. Now, the government's response to that was to put out all the mortality data and give parents the freedom to choose their own hospital. But you think about it, is a nightmare. It's an impossible choice. You can't actually make that decision. League tables are useless if you don't account for the different caseloads those hospitals have, some taking on really complicated cases. So what did it do? It really it causes stress for people. You have parents taking their children across the country trying to find a better hospital unnecessarily. You have hospitals trying to justify that they've got a higher death rate when they're dealing with much more complex cases. And this sort of came ahead in 2013 when Leeds shut their unit because their death rate was above the expected rate. when you look at the performance. So there's a kind of real standoff between parents and hospitals, understanding. Into this fray step the two statisticians who we work with to create a website that gives people the information they need helpfully. More critically, we co-developed the website with parents, with researchers, with doctors, and with the families involved. And that critically led to two things. One, working with the families meant we were using the right language. So, for example, talking about survival rates is much preferable than mortality rates when you're talking about their baby. Talking about unforeseeable factors affecting the fact that you can't know exactly how well a hospital will perform. There's that variability. That's much better language to engage people with than talking about the chance and luck of variability. Again, when you're talking about, the choice they're having to make for their child. For us, the measure of success is the fact that it's the parents involved who explained and communicated the information to other parents and their community. And I think the take-home, I think, is, never underestimate the public. There is no issue that is too complicated or too sensitive if it's really relevant and important to people, and if you involve them honestly. And that word honestly, I appreciate, is doing a lot of heavy lifting. It's talking about the uncertainty that David mentioned. It's talking about being flexible as to where you go and appreciating that the questions they have might be not the ones you have or the ones you've thought of. And at the heart of this is layering that information. That's something we come back to. Just like most of us, when we read a news story, we want the most important information first. Here it's exactly the same. Parents go to that website, they get what they need, the questions that are on their mind probably first, and then they can dig deeper, which gives them the reassurance they need that what they've got is solid. But, that's why academic papers are obviously the worst training for this, aren't they? Here's my credit, here's why, no, wait for it, yeah, and this is why it works, Like I say, the approach you take is going to be different for different audiences. If I've got 3 minutes to, explain a new innovation to an MP, that's a very different conversation to if you're trying to engage the media in an issue and pick up an issue, or if you are talking to, the wider public about something that's come in. But I think it's worth remembering is that the limitation is really our willingness and our ability to engage. It's never the public's intelligence, and that's why that layering of information is always so important. It's about making it accessible. We all have a limited amount of time. It reminds me, there was a nice, interesting conversation picked up in Nature about a week ago, discussing whether science communication, we should have the same integrity standards as we do for research integrity. And I think there is a case about, if you can't publish in a paper, you probably shouldn't claim it in public. But again, it comes back to that, I think, that idea of needing to be really honest about what we do and don't know and that uncertainty. And it is hard, but I think, as David said, if we don't do that, we are being disingenuous and we are being actively unhelpful. I was thinking this, for me, it feels like when I read the supplementary information of a journal, have they put that there to empower me, to be able to really interrogate paper, to ask new questions, to actually challenge the assumptions the authors have made and the conclusions they've made? Or has it been dumped there to bamboozle me, to crush me with data and show me that I am inferior and I should not question it? I think I see some familiar faces. I think we've all seen papers like that, and I think sometimes with our communications, there's the risk of doing the same thing. We touched on, government communications during COVID. again, trying to, not really empower people, but trying to put them in their place. I'm going to give you a very quick shout out at this point to the Harding Prize, which is awarded by Cambridge in partnership with the Science Media Centre and ourselves. And it's for trustworthy communication. It's for communication that helps. And when we judge, that prize, the question that always comes to mind is this article, this video, is it telling people what to think, or is it helping people to think? And it's the latter that is good, useful communication. I'm going to flag a couple of I guess there should be a couple of caveats. One is listening is hard and you need to be prepared for the unexpected. Do we all remember Boaty McBoatface? When NERC decided it would be a great idea to trust the great British public to name their £200 million Arctic ship. Although before we all snigger at the public, I've seen what some of the greatest mathematical minds in Cambridge have written on the blackboard in the toilets. And it's pretty much at that level, isn't it? So I think for me this is a wonderful example because it's a conversation that goes in a different direction. And you can argue that it's a backlash to being patronised. In the end, the ship, I think it's called the Sir David Attenborough, isn't it? And it's the little submarine that got to be named Boaty McBoatface. But Boaty McBoatface is very popular. It's got, more publicity and engagement with National Geographic Centre than everything else they've done beforehand, I think. So, public don't always give you what you want, but if you work with it and engage with it, you do end up in a good place. The other flag I think is worth saying is it's about remembering what science and maths is there for, and what science communication can do. We're there about providing information to answer questions, but we're not there to answer the questions for people. We encourage people to ask for evidence. They do that. But we can ask for all the evidence in the world. Some decisions aren't being based on evidence. Some people make decisions based on values rather than evidence. And that's fine. For me, it's frustrating when the two get blurred. So during the pandemic, follow the science being a label that's stuck on everything when it's clearly a political decision. There's nothing wrong with a political decision, but you need to own it. And I think the same for us with our communication. I think it's thinking about, is this a testable question or a pollable question? If I say, Cambridge should host the Olympics because it will boost the economy and sort out the transport infrastructure, yeah, you could look at me cynically, but you can go away and you can collect the data, you can test that, you can come back and say, to quote David, bollocks. But if I say Cambridge should host the Olympics because it will, it's a matter of prestige, that's, you don't throw data at me, that's a pollable question. You can ask people if they agree, but it's a value and a belief. And I think, if we think back to those Bangladeshi fishers, just because people's don't make what we consider the right decision, it doesn't mean that it's about scientific understanding. It's about how they've been informed. And sometimes, frustratingly, it's about values, We could argue for hours, couldn't we, about prison reform. We know what works. We know what doesn't work, which is what we do with prisons. But if there's a heartfelt belief that the most important thing is punishment, and that's what we're going to do, even if everything we put in place doesn't work, then that is the decision that's made. So there's thinking about where our information comes in, and also they're not being too frustrated if people make decisions we wouldn't make. The last thing, I'm going to just flag our Voice of Young Science. I'll be talking about that programme providing training and support for young researchers in the lightning talks. But I think, for me, what I want to flag is it is acknowledging that communication is really hard. I think I want to go back to that. Nothing is too complicated or sensitive to be discussed, but if we give it enough time and effort. But I think there's also a reality that it's hard. There are some issues out there where bringing new research and new data into the conversation is challenging. It's not what people want to hear. It's not what they wanted. It's not what they expected. But, you know, and I think there's a risk that we see people stepping away from doing work in that area, because who wants the prospect of being cancelled because, your analysis provided the results that people didn't like. But I would say it is in those areas where bringing the data science is particularly important, because it's those sensitive issues, it's those contentious issues where society really needs us to step up, provide the evidence and communicate it really well. So with that in mind, I want to give a quick shout out for the other award we give, which is the Maddox Prize, which we give with Nature, which recognises courageous researchers who inform public discourse with sound science and evidence despite the challenges they face. And I would encourage you to do have a visit and look at some of the really inspiring past winners, but also look at that to recognise that there's a challenge there for all of us. So I kind of want to conclude, I think, by saying I think there's a role for all of us in creating an environment where we can have calm and respectful discussions about data and science and evidence, whatever the issue, and communicating that clearly and well is absolutely the heart of that. So yeah, I think I'll conclude by just saying, I think, please, be inspiring, be insightful, be informative, be impressive, but when you can be useful in your communications, please be useful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. That was really interesting. We've got time for one or two questions. Anyone has any?
So what do you see as the major future challenge to the integrity of science?
The integrity, the major future challenge.
Or the perception of the integrity of science?
I mean, that's a huge one, isn't it? I mean, I think we are picking our way through a lot. I think it's the real challenge is probably making, as scientists, getting our house in order. I think, there's concerns about, we can talk about paper mills and we can talk about AI-generated content, which now potentially is going to be AI reviewed. And I mean, let's let AI can read it as well, can't it? But I think there's a challenge. We're very conscious that 20 years ago, for example, peer review wasn't a thing that was discussed. Journalists wouldn't ask if something was peer reviewed. And I would say Sense About Science, one of the reasons it was set up was help to challenge those things. But I think, things are moving very quickly now. During the pandemic, we learned that peer review, and the time frames of those aren't always practical. There's really interesting initiatives, I think, around the synthesis of evidence and how we move forward. I think if I'm going to have to pick one, and there's all, I don't have the answers to publishing models, all those things, but I think my concern, I think, is if we take shortcuts, or if we decide that the means justify the ends in terms of, not being honest ourselves, or not engaging people properly, and just trying to take the shortcut because we think, and I said it, maybe going back to the pandemic, hands, face, space, great for 3 weeks, not for 6 months, especially if the hands bit isn't important anymore. So, but I think I'm worried that I see there's a temptation in science as well. When you're faced with so much misinformation, you suddenly think, actually, we're going to play by those rules as well and take shortcuts. And then, once you've accepted that premise, where do you go from there? It's really hard to come back.